Hi everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar on the TN visa. My name is Dustin Saldarriaga, and I'm a Senior Associate at Scott Legal PC. Today we're going to spend time, as I mentioned, focusing on the TN visa, which is the NAFTA-based treaty between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. The TN visa really is an excellent option for nationals of Canada or Mexico who want to come to the US to work at a US employer. We'll talk about the requirements for the visa, the strategy behind a strong TN visa application, as well as one of the most common questions we receive, which is what the responsibilities of the employer are and whether the visa requires sponsorship. A few things before we get started. This webinar is part of a series. We try to do at least 2 of these webinars a month on a variety of immigration topics. And right now, I think we're doing about 2 a week. So there is plenty of material, plenty of opportunities, excuse me, to take part in those. We will send you an email following this webinar where you can sign up for our future webinars. This webinar is being recorded. We post our recorded webinars to our YouTube channel, the full-length webinars. And we also post shorter videos to our YouTube channel, and these span a variety of immigration topics. So do check those out. We're really proud to put out high-quality information that's available to the public for free. We also do have an extensive blog on our website, which is also a wonderful source of information. After the webinar, I mentioned we'll send an email. That email will also include the PowerPoint presentation that you see on your screen, as well as a comprehensive guide to the TN visa. Now, one quick note, as you may have already noticed, our firm is a full-service immigration firm. So though we do focus on employment and business-based visas such as the TN, we handle the full range of U.S. immigration visas, whether that's family, humanitarian, etc. So don't hesitate to reach out to us if we can be helpful at all. Now, we'll go ahead and dive in and look at the TN visa. So let's start by looking at the TN visa requirements. The TN visa is a treaty-based visa, and it's a treaty between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. So the first requirement to apply for a TN visa is that you do need to have a passport from either Canada or Mexico. You can be a dual citizen, but you do need to have that passport. You simply will not be approved if you don't have a passport from Canada or Mexico. You need to be coming to the US to work for an employer in the US, and you need to be coming to work for that employer in one of the listed professions. So if you look at the TN regulations, if you're at your computer, I do recommend that you go ahead and Google TN regulations, and you'll see, once you pull that up, a list of professions, starting with accountant, architect, computer systems analyst, going to librarian, lawyer, social worker, dentist, veterinarian, chemist, biologist, college teacher, professors, seminary professors. So there are a variety of professions that you see listed, but not all professions are listed. So you do need to be coming to the US to work in one of those listed professions. Once you've identified which profession you're coming to the US to work in, so let's say you're coming to the US to work as a lawyer, you would look in the regulations and see if you qualify for that job. And when I say you qualify for the job, I'm not talking about qualifying based on the employer's requirements. The employer might want to see that you have 10 years of experience as a lawyer. That doesn't matter. What matters is what the regulations say. So what the regulations say for a lawyer, you need to have a professional license, a degree in law, an LLB, a JD, or a licenciatura degree. That's 5 years, or membership in a bar. So those are the requirements. There is no experience requirement for a lawyer. If you're coming to the US to work as an accountant, you need either a bachelor's degree or a professional license. So again, no experience requirement. However, let's look at management consultant. If you're coming to the US as a management consultant to work as a management consultant, you need either a bachelor's degree or the equivalent professional experience as established by a statement showing that you have at least 5 years either as a management consultant or in a field of specialty that's related to what you'll be doing in the US. And we'll talk about the management consulting category later. I use that example just to show that the profession you're coming to the US to work in really does define how you qualify. For some professions, a degree is enough. For others, you do need experience. For some, you can use a combination. For example, a graphic designer, you can have a bachelor's degree or a post-secondary diploma or post-secondary certificate and 3 years of experience. So either the bachelor's degree or the post-secondary degree plus experience. So look at the regulations to figure out if you qualify. So going back to our slide, you need to be a citizen, have a passport from Canada or Mexico, need to be coming to the US to work for a US employer in one of the listed professions. You do need to have a predefined job, meaning a prearranged job, meaning that you actually need to have the job offer in hand. And we'll talk about what you need to bring to the TN interview, but one of the important pieces is a letter from the US employer saying that they are ready to start employing you once you enter the US or receive TN status. And in that job in the US, you need to actually be performing the job duties that are associated with that job. So as a typical example, let's say someone wants to come to the US to work in marketing. They are great at social media. They have worked for years developing Facebook ad campaigns, Google ad campaigns, and they really are an expert in this. Unfortunately, there is no profession listed in the TN regulations that is a great fit for marketers. So marketers need to think about what they're actually going to be doing in the US. And there's a chance that what they'll be doing in the US is actually aligned with another profession that is on the list, such as perhaps management consultant. They might be coming to the US to advise clients on how they can improve their marketing. So that's just an example to show, if you're coming to the US as a management consultant, you need to be doing what the government thinks a management consultant does. If you're coming to the US as an accountant, you need to be coming to the US to do what an accountant does. So what does the government think an accountant does or a management consultant does? Fortunately, the government publishes this in something called the Occupational Outlook Handbook, which we call the OOH for short. So if you Google OOH accountant, then just as an example, you will see at the top of your screen there are a number of tabs on that website. You can click the tab that says what they do. And at that tab, you see a list of job duties. So regardless, that's an example for accountants. If you are coming to the US in any of the listed professions on a TN, go to OOH, search for your specific profession, look at the job duties, and make sure that you're coming to the US to actually perform job duties that are aligned with those that are in the OOH. They don't have to be identical and probably shouldn't be identical because the officer might think it's odd that you've copied and pasted the OOH, but they should be aligned. You should be primarily doing job duties similar to what the OOH thinks you should be doing in your specific profession. And again, if you're coming to the US to work in a profession that is not on the TN list, either the TN's not a good fit and you need to find another visa option, or you need to think about whether your job duties could fit under another profession. So let's say, going back to the marketing example, you decide to go for the management consulting category because there's no good marketing profession in the TN regulations. You need to make sure, do I have a bachelor's degree in management consulting? Or do I have sufficient experience to qualify for the management consulting category? So see if your job duties fit within a profession and then make sure that you qualify for that profession. One quick note, when I say qualify for the profession, I've mentioned the bachelor's degree a few times. The regulations do talk about a baccalaureate degree. Your degree should be in the field that you're applying in. So if you're coming to the US as an accountant based on your bachelor's degree, the bachelor's degree should ideally be in accounting. If it's in a related field, such as finance, economics, statistics, it can work. You just need to make it clear in your application, look at your transcript, and show that you have actually completed significant coursework in accounting or in the field that you're coming to work in. If your degree is in a completely unrelated field, so let's say you're coming to the US to work as an accountant, you don't have a license in accounting, and your undergraduate degree is in English, you're going to have a very, very difficult time getting approved. So our recommendation would be to look for another category that does fit with your job duties. If that's not possible, you may have to look for another visa option, such as an H-1B, an L-1, visas like that, an O-1 potentially. What is sponsorship? One of the most common questions that we get at our firm is from employers, and they're worried about the responsibilities of having a TN employee. So the question we get is, do I as an employer have to sponsor this worker for a TN? And the short answer is no. The reason why we would say no is that what sponsorship means in the context of US immigration is quite extensive. So visas that do require sponsorship would be the H-1B, certain employment-based green cards. And what those visas, not the TN, but what those visas require is, for example, the employer has to apply to the US government to figure out what the prevailing wage is, what they have to pay this worker. They might have to test the labor market in the US, advertise the job, interview US workers, make sure there are no US workers for the job. They might have responsibilities to the worker once the worker comes to the US, such as, for example, they cannot what's called bench the worker. If the worker comes to the US, they have to be employed. They can't be put on leave, for example. And if they're terminated, the employer might have to pay for their return transportation home. None of those requirements applies to a TN. For a TN, all the employer has to do is give the employee a letter that is signed by the employer that explains who the employer is, what the job offer is, what the job duties are, what they intend to pay, for what period of time, and basically to provide that letter with an original signature to the employee so that they can apply for the visa. If the employee is approved, they are an at-will employee, just like any other employee in the US. So they can be fired, they can quit. There is no requirement of a prevailing wage. You do have to pay minimum wage, as again you would have to do for any employee. But there's no other requirement that is similar to the H-1B or the employment-based green cards. And for that reason, we do tell employers sponsorship is not required for a TN. If the employee applies from within the US, one slight difference is that the employer does need to sign the application forms. So that's the I-129. Again, not a big deal. It would just be the employer's signature on those forms. If the employee applies at a border, the applicant is the one submitting the application. From within the US, an application is submitted by the employer. Just a slight difference. Again, no additional responsibilities are created by that. It's just procedurally slightly different. Differences for Canadians and Mexican nationals. So as I said, to qualify for a TN, you do need a passport from either Canada or Mexico. Canadians really do have an easier application process when compared to Mexicans. And the reason for that is that Canadians can apply at a port of entry. This is extremely convenient. What this means is basically a national of Canada can either go to an international airport in Canada or any other country, or can approach a land crossing and will present their application materials at the border or at the airport. The Customs and Border Protection officer will review the materials and will make a decision then and there about whether to admit the applicant in TN status. And the moment the person enters the US in TN status, they have that status, and they can start working for the TN employer. Canadian nationals have two other options to apply, and both of those other two options are also available to nationals of Mexico. those two options are apply at a consulate. So a national of Canada or a national of Mexico can submit their TN application to a consulate. They would do that by filing a form DS-160 online. And then they would be scheduled for an interview where they would show up to the consulate at the scheduled time, do biometrics, provide their application materials, have a brief interview, and then the consular officer would either approve or deny the visa, put it in their passport if they're approved, and then the applicant would be able to come into the US. The third option is to apply from within the US. If the applicant is already inside the US, they can submit an application to USCIS to either change their status from any other status to TN. Could be F1 student status, could be a B2 visitor, B1 visitor to TN status. Or if they're already in TN status, they can extend their status through USCIS. Again, an application that goes to USCIS is technically submitted by the employer, not by the employee. If the applicant applies either at a border, at an airport, or at a consulate, the application is submitted by the employee, not by the employer. Now, practically speaking, Canadians would rarely apply at a consulate, and the reason is that it is much more time consuming than applying at a port of entry. So Canadians really do have an easier time. They can just show up at a border or an airport and apply. Mexicans cannot do that. They have to apply at a consulate or in the US. Canadians might apply at a consulate if they have a dependent, a spouse or a child who's not a national of Canada. So if, say, you're married to someone who has a passport from Italy, so you are a national of Canada, your spouse has a passport from Italy, they would have to go to the consulate for the visa. So they cannot apply at the port of entry. And in those cases, we do see that even the Canadian national might want to go to the consulate with their spouse. So that's one of the unique and rare occasions when a national of Canada would apply at a consulate rather than at a port of entry. So let's talk briefly about visa validity versus status. So nationals of Mexico, like I said, need to go to a consulate, are given a visa. Okay, so if they're given a visa, it will typically be granted for either 1 year or 4 years for nationals of Mexico. Nationals of Canada can receive TN visas for up to 3 years. So that is what the validity period of a visa is just the window of time when you can ask to enter the United States. So if you're granted a 3-year visa, you can ask to enter the US for that 3-year window. The moment you enter the US, you are usually given TN status for 3 years. So even if you're given a 1-year visa, when you ask to enter the US, you can ask for 3 years of status. And oftentimes, Customs and Border Protection will give you that. And what defines your period of stay once you're in the US, when you have to leave, is when your status expires, not when your visa expires. So your status expires on the date that's stated on what's called your I-94 form. So each time you enter the US, you are issued an I-94 form. Now it is online, so you do have to check that online. But the date that the I-94 says you need to leave the US is the date you have to leave. It is not the date that your visa expires. And for nationals of Mexico, last bullet point on the screen, sometimes you can do a renewal through the mail. The consulate, once you apply through the consulate, they will reach out and let you know if you qualify for that. It's not something you typically would request beforehand. Let's talk briefly about difficult TN categories. As I mentioned before, the TN regulations list several dozen professions or categories. So going from accountants to lawyers to management consultants. There are certain categories, certain professions that are uniquely challenging, and two of those are management consultants and economists. The reason is different for each of those, the reason why they're difficult. So for management consultants, these are difficult because this is one of the few categories that does not require a degree. Almost every TN occupation requires that you have a baccalaureate degree or some combination of a postgraduate diploma or certificate plus experience. So if you don't have either of those things, you don't have a degree and you don't have a post-secondary certificate or diploma, management consultant is going to be one of the few categories that you can apply for because it does allow you to apply based on experience alone. And again, as you can see on this bullet point, that experience can be based on 5 years of experience as a management consultant or 5 years of experience in a field of specialty that's related to the consulting agreement. The example I like to use here is, let's say you are a national of Mexico who is an expert in solar panels, developing them, designing them, say the supply chain of manufacturing them. And there is you don't have a college degree, and there is a company in the US that that does exactly this. They design, they manufacture solar panels, and they want you to come to the US from Mexico to work for them and advise them on how to improve their manufacturing processes, etc. How would you qualify? You would have to show that you have 5 years of experience in the field of specialty, which in this case could be the manufacture of solar panels. You would have to show through letters from your past employers that have ideally original signatures that say, yes, the applicant worked for us for 5 years, developing solar panels, and we attest to the fact that they have this experience. It can be a combination. So for example, if you worked for 3 employers, the first for 2 years, the second for 2 years, the third for 1 year, that adds up to 5 years, that is okay. But you would be able to qualify based on that experience. And the management consulting category is one of the few categories that allows you to do that based on experience alone. So because management consultants can qualify based on experience alone, it does tend to be a catch-all category. In other words, if someone doesn't have a degree, they oftentimes will simply apply in the management consulting category, even if they're not a good fit for that category. When I say a good fit, you do still need to do the job duties that are listed in the Occupational Outlook Handbook for Management Consultants. So Google that, OOH, Management Consultant, and you'll see what the government thinks management consultants do. So even if you're coming to the US to work for that solar panel company that I mentioned before, you do need to be satisfying those job duties that the government talks about, like meeting with management, looking at data, coming up with recommendations and seeing how those recommendations are implemented, things like that. So there are ways to make a management consultant application stronger. And let me here quickly pause and say that there is a spectrum in terms of the strength of management consultant applications. If you're coming to the US to work for a management consulting firm, so let's say that you are in Mexico, you work for McKinsey, and McKinsey wants you to come to the US to work for McKinsey New York. That is not a challenging application. You would be able to show that you have experience as a management consultant, or you have the bachelor's degree and you're coming to work for a management consulting firm. So not a risky application. What is a risky management consultant application is if you're coming to the US to work for a firm that's not a management consulting firm. Again, my example is a good one to show that. So the company is a solar panel company. It's not a management consulting company. You can still get approval to do that. It's just going to be especially challenging. So how do you strengthen that type of management consultant application? The way you do that is there are a few things, and of course you always have to be honest in these applications. So I'm not saying this to fabricate these things. You really do need to work with the US employer to make sure that you've arranged this so that it is true. And when you're presenting it to the border officer, you can explain to them that you will in fact be coming into the US to do what I am about to say would make for a stronger application. The first is, if it's possible for your services to go to third-party clients, that is ideal. So for example, a traditional management consultant firm, management consultants are paid by the management consulting firm, but they are actually serving third-party clients. If you work for McKinsey, you could be hired by Pfizer. McKinsey is hired by Pfizer. You are going to Pfizer and advising Pfizer on how to improve its manufacturing, its research and development, etc. But you're paid by McKinsey. So if you are able to recreate that structure, let's say our solar panel company is going to be a difficult one, but if our solar panel company did advise other companies on how they could improve their manufacturing, then that solar panel company starts to look a little more like a traditional management consulting firm. If it can't be done, it can't be done, but if it can be done, that could strengthen an application. Other ways to strengthen an application in the management consulting category are to make the actual employment arrangement look more like a traditional management consultant arrangement. So one of the clear rules on this is that those coming to the US in this category, management consultants who are working at a company that is not a management consulting firm, cannot fill a permanent role. They need to be coming to the US basically to perform a temporary role to advise the company. And that does make sense, because if you think traditionally about management consultants, they arrive at a company to address a specific challenge. And once they have addressed that challenge, they're done. So let's go back to our solar panel example. If you are able to frame that as the applicant has 5 years of experience doing this in Mexico, improving the manufacture and development of solar panels, they're going to come to the US to work for our company in the US because we need help addressing a specific challenge. That challenge is our manufacturing process is too expensive, our solar panels are not efficient. So this applicant is going to come to the US to address that specific challenge. They are going to be paid according to the deliverables. So they are going to, research, our processes. For doing that, they're going to provide presentations and they're going to be paid X. They are going to actually work with staff on implementing these things. For that, they're going to be paid Y. There are different things you can do to make that arrangement look a lot more like a traditional management consultant role. What does not look like a management consultant role is, for example, if that solar panel company usually has a full-time person doing that kind of work. They have a manufacturing position, and that person recently left. And they're looking to fill that role at the company with someone, this applicant from Mexico. That's going to be a hard sell, especially if the person is paid a salary, is working full-time there. That doesn't look like a management consultant role. It looks like a permanent role. So that's what you would want to avoid in the management consulting category. A lot of information I know that I shared with the management consulting category. Just keep in mind, you want it to look like a traditional management consultant arrangement. And again, it has to actually be that way in practice. You don't just frame the application that way, not intending to do it once you arrive. That is not a good thing to do. Let's look at the economist category real quick. The economist category is challenging for a reason completely different from the management consultant category. The economist category is difficult because the US government issued a policy memo in 2017 that narrowed the scope of what an economist can do in the TN category. In the past, people were coming to the US in the economist category to work as financial analysts and market research analysts. And the government basically said they don't want people doing that anymore. So what do financial analysts do and market research analysts? Financial analysts are basically helping find opportunities for investments. So they're helping companies profit from investments in general. Market research analysts are basically looking for opportunities to market products and services. So let's contrast that with what the government thinks economists should do. And again, to do that, I'll Google OOH, economist. You click that link, you click what they do, and you see duties. Economists typically do the following. They research economic issues. They conduct surveys, collect data. They analyze data using mathematical models, statistics, and other software. They interpret and forecast trends. They advise businesses, governments, and individuals on fiscal policy or economic topics, and they present their research. Now, there's more there. You can keep reading the page, but the point is, when you're applying as an economist, you want to make sure that your job duties are closely aligned to what the Occupational Outlook Handbook says an economist should do. And if your job duties are closer to what financial analysts do or market research analysts, you are facing a very high likelihood of a denial. So let's look at the TN application process. We already talked a little bit about this when I talked about differences between Canadian nationals and Mexican nationals. We'll quickly run through the bullets you see on your screen. Canadians can apply at a port of entry. Nationals of Mexico cannot. So to do that, the Canadian would apply, they would provide their job offer letter and their supporting documentation, evidencing proof that they are a citizen of Canada, as well as their educational or professional qualifications. And again, those are defined in the regulations, how you qualify. Some ports of entry are optimized for faster TN processing. So if you are applying for a TN for the first time, and just as a general practice, it's a good idea to call the port of entry ahead of time and ask if what hours they are accepting applications, if there are any unique or special procedures you'll need to follow, just to make sure that you don't have any unpleasant surprises when you arrive the day of. Nationals of Mexico must apply at a consulate if they're not applying from within the US. To do that, they'd file a DS-160 form, they'd pay the application fee, schedule their biometrics, which is their fingerprints, and they would schedule the appointment at the consulate, and then they'd attend their interview. At that point, usually the visa is issued within a few days of that interview. If they are eligible for a renewal by mail, the consulate will let the person know before scheduling the interview. Usually they'll reach out by email and let the applicant know. And finally, applying from within the US, Mexicans and Canadians can do this. The employer would file the I-129 with the supporting documentation. Real quick, what is the supporting documentation? So a TN application needs to have a few things. You need to have proof of your citizenship, so a copy, or you need your original Canadian or Mexican passport. If you're applying to USCIS from within the US, a copy is fine, but at a port of entry or at the consulate, your original passport is definitely required. You need proof that you qualify. So if you're qualifying based on your degree, bring your original diploma. I know it sounds crazy, but you need the original diploma. If you need to get into your transcript, so again, if your degree is related or not related to the profession, and you're showing that you actually took courses in the field, bring a certified copy of the transcript or the original transcript with you. You also, and finally, if you're qualifying based on experience, bring letters from your past employers with the original signatures on them talking about how many years of experience you have. You also need your employer letter. This is really the heart of a TN application. So what this is a letter that is signed by the US employer that is on their original, that's on their letterhead, has their original signature, and talks about who they are as an employer, who you are, how you qualify for the TN, what the job opportunity is in the US, what the job duties will be. They should be aligned with the job duties in the Occupational Outlook Handbook, how long they intend to employ you, between 1 year and 3 years, and at what pay rate. So that letter really is the representation to the government of how you qualify. It's going to lay out everything, and it really is a key document. One quick side note, one other thing to keep in mind with management consultants is one of the ways you can strengthen it is by having a shorter period of time. So if you're applying to be a management consultant for 3 years, that's risky since it looks like a more permanent role. If you're applying for 1 or 2 years, that's generally better because you want to show that you're coming to the US for a discrete period of time to address a very specific challenge. And again, the shorter the period of time, the better that does look for management consultants. Okay, and going back to our slide, the final bullet, if you're applying within the US, you would apply through USCIS. You'd have a Form I-129 that you'd submit to USCIS with the supporting documents, and those would be copies of what I said before. So passport, how you qualify, whether a degree and transcript, or experience, as well as your employer letter. And finally, some tips and common TN visa pitfalls. As I mentioned before, it's always good practice to call ahead, talk with the port of entry, see what their procedures are, see when they're open, make sure that you're arriving within that window of time. Make sure that the person who signed the employer letter is available to answer a call at the time of your interview. Sometimes consular officers and border officers will call the person who signs that letter. So it's always good to just give that person a heads up. I'm going to be going to the border between 3 and 5 or noon and 3 tomorrow. Can you just have your phone with me in case they call? And if they do call, usually it's just to confirm that the job opportunity is legitimate. Bring your original diploma, official transcripts, and the original signed version of the employer letter if at all possible. Consular officers do see a lot of fraud. So as a result, they usually want to see original documentation. And finally, the TN visa is a non-immigrant visa. That means it's not a green card. You do need to show that you intend to leave the US at the end of your visa. So be prepared to show ties to your home country, whether Canada or Mexico. So that can be copies of bank statements from those countries, a lease agreement or a mortgage agreement or a mortgage payment receipt, really anything that shows your ties. Now, this usually does not come up if you are applying for the first, second, or even third time. But once you start applying for the third, fourth time for a TN, it can be renewed indefinitely, but the government might start asking questions about whether you really intend for this to be temporary. So have that proof with you that you do still have ties to your home country. All right, that concludes our presentation, the slideshow. So let's go ahead and look at some questions. And feel free to send your questions, and we do have a few more minutes, so I'm happy to talk through those questions. All right, one question, tell us about HR consultants. Are they eligible for management consultants? That entirely depends on whether the job duties in that role are aligned with what the Occupational Outlook Handbook defines that a management consultant does. So if we Google OOH, management consultant, they use the title management analyst. So if we click that and click what they do, we see management analysts typically gather and organize information about the problems to be solved or procedures to be improved, interview personnel to determine the methods, equipment, and personnel that will be needed to solve that problem, analyze financial and other data, develop solutions or alternative practices, recommend new systems, procedures, or organizational changes, make recommendations to management, and confer with managers to ensure changes are working. So my gut reaction is that it would be a difficult thing for an HR consultant to do that, but there's a chance they would. So if your role is to come to the US to consult for a company and improve their HR practices, then yes, that could be approved, but just be ready to strengthen the application, because that is a risky application. Any application in the management consulting category is risky unless you're working for a management consulting firm. And a lawyer can definitely be helpful for those types of applications. Excuse me. All right, can you talk a little bit more about applying inside the US? So sure, if you're inside the US, you would typically have status. So you would have entered on a B1, B2 visa, or if you are visa exempt, say you are Canadian and visa exempt, you would still be issued an I-94 and you would be given B1 or B2 status upon entry. So, excuse me. The first step I would recommend is going to the Customs and Border Protection website and looking at your current I-94. So if you Google CBP I-94, you'll find the website. You plug in your passport information, your name, birth date, and it will show you your current I-94. I'm sorry. So once you know what your status is, you can generally apply to change or extend that status. So if you're in the US in, say, B2 status, you can file an application with USCIS to change your status to TN status. So let's say you're in B2 status and you find out that there's an employer that wants to employ you as a lawyer. You could develop a TN application and submit that application to USCIS. The employer would submit that. So it would be an I-129 that the employer would submit to USCIS with all the supporting documentation that we talked about before. And important to note, you cannot start working for the US employer until USCIS approves that application. So that is absolutely critical. Do not start working for an employer until you have work authorization. Otherwise, you violate your status, which can create a whole host of problems. So don't do that. Wait for the USCIS approval. And once they've approved, they'll have a date there that says your TN status is valid starting on X date. And as of X date, you can start working for the TN employer. Few little details I'll also throw in. You can work part-time on a TN. You can also work for more than one TN employer. As long as you've received that approval, you can work for more than one employer. So to work for more than one employer, you would either submit a TN application to USCIS and make it clear you're asking for concurrent status to work for two employers, or you could take both of those TN applications with you to the border if you're a national of Canada, apply at a border, and the border officer can give you concurrent TN status. Or if you're a national of Mexico, you can apply at a consulate for concurrent employment in TN status. But again, don't work for an employer until you have that approval. What is the route from TN visa to a green card? We have a whole series of videos on this, so check out our YouTube channel. We also have a number of blog posts on this topic. I will quickly say that it is possible to apply for a green card while you are in the US in TN status, but it is tricky. And the reason for that is a few things. First of all, you need to be careful not to have the intention to apply for a green card when you enter on a TN or when you apply to change or extend your TN status. The government, like I said before, the TN visa is a non-immigrant visa. So what that means is you cannot apply for the TN or enter in TN status. So the moment you enter, you cannot have the intention to adjust your status, which means to apply for a green card. So assuming you don't have that intention, so let's say you enter in TN status and you're working for your employer for a few months and they say, hey, we really love the work you're doing. We want to sponsor you for a green card. Great. At that point, you've waited a few months. You didn't have the intention. That is perfectly fine to file a green card application. Or let's say you enter in TN status to work for the employer, and a few months later, you decide, you know what? I've fallen in love and I'm getting married and I want to get a green card based on my marriage. If that wasn't your intention when you applied for the green card or when you entered, perfectly fine to apply for a green card based on that. So the route to do that, it depends whether you're applying based on employment or family. If you're applying based on employment, the employer has to go through a number of requirements, testing the market, applying for the prevailing wage. If you're applying based on family, then the family sponsor needs to file an application for you. Important to note is once that application is filed, so once the employer files, it's called an I-140, or the family member files the I-130, those are the initial petitions for an employment-based or a family-based petition, green card petition, you're going to have a hard time entering in TN status. So you want to make sure you have a good length of time on your TN visa before you file, or the employer or your family member files that I-130 or I-140, and that's why it's tricky. So So this is where it's really helpful to talk with a lawyer, because what you don't want to happen is you apply to renew your TN, or you leave and come back in TN status and they say, we see you have a green card application, we're not letting you in. And there are ways to minimize that risk, but it is what you need to navigate. Again, lots more to say on that topic, TN visa to a green card. It can be done. It requires navigating a number of obstacles that a lawyer would probably be very helpful to help you with. Of course, our firm is happy to help with that. Can you apply for a category such as computer analyst and have a different title in the job offer? Yes. So the title that the employer uses, sometimes employers will use a different internal job title. So in this question, can I apply as a computer analyst under the TN regulations, but the employer calls it project manager or IT project manager? The answer is you can definitely have a different title at the employer, and in the employer letter, it can use a different title. The one thing I will say is it does invite questions if the title is different. So if it's possible to have the same title as is used in the TN regulations, that's recommended, just because the officer looks at it, it makes sense. Whereas if the officer is looking at an application that you say, I'm coming as a computer analyst, my application says project manager, it's not clear based on project manager what your job duties are going to be. So it invites them to look much more closely at that. Also, something like project manager, you want to be careful that most of your job duties are doing what computer systems analysts are supposed to do and not acting as managers. So it's fine to be a manager, but you don't want most of your job duties to be managing other people if you're supposed to be coming to the US to work as a computer systems analyst. So just make sure most of your job duties are doing the job duties that the Occupational Outlook Handbook says your profession is supposed to do. For graphic designers, can they work in any company that require a graphic designer or only a graphic design agency? Great question. For most of these categories, as long as the employer can show that they have a need for the worker, the employer can employ the worker. So actually, the regulations have a very broad definition of what a US employer is. And it is basically an LLC, a corporation, or even a sole proprietorship. It can just be someone in the US who just runs their own thing that needs someone from Canada or Mexico to help them. As long as that employer can show that they can pay the person and they have a need for that role, say they can show they need a graphic designer, it's okay for that application to be filed, even if they're not a graphic design agency. Really, the only exception to that is with management consultants, where anyone can apply for a TN management consultant, but your level of risk really does increase if your company is not a management consulting firm. You can definitely be approved. We've had many management consultant applications approved, though of course that doesn't guarantee they'll continue to be approved. Past results don't predict future outcomes, but you can be approved in the management consulting category. You just have to be very deliberate about how you present the application and talk with the employer to make sure that they are flexible about shaping the opportunity in a way that's aligned with what the government wants to see. Well, that answers all of the questions that have come in. Great questions. Thank you all for taking the time. Please do check out our YouTube channel for more videos on TN visas and a variety of topics, and keep an eye out for the email we'll send you afterward, which will have our PowerPoint presentation, a very comprehensive guide on the TN visa, as well as an invitation to sign up for our future webinars. We really do hope to see you in the future. Thank you for taking the time. Have a great day.